Holy Spirit to be the wind in our sails. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen. You guys can have a seat. All right, well, today is an exciting day. I know a lot of you are here because we have a guest speaker with us today, Jeff Huxford. And Jeff and I have a little history. It's funny, we were talking when he pulled in today that I haven't seen him since his wedding day, but then he was like, well, I came to your wedding. So we're not sure. It may have been at my wedding was the last time I saw Jeff. But then they moved up north to Demont, Indiana, and then now they're all the way down in Tennessee, so we don't get to see each other. And it's kind of one of those things where you have a friend. I was good friends with his wife in college, and you have this friend, and they move far away. You don't see them very often, but in the modern world, we keep up with people on social media. And so, you know, I would see posts about their family every once in a while, and things that were going on with their lives. And then there was a day, it was about 5 years ago, where his wife, Jackie, posted something that definitely got my attention. That Jeff had been in a terrible car crash. And she just asked people to pray. And so my wife and I prayed, and we prayed faithfully the next couple weeks as we weren't sure if Jeff was going to make it. And we continued to get these updates and follow the story and to come and find out that Jeff was going to survive, but damage had been done. And you know, you're following this from a distance, and you're praying for people that you love, trying to make sure that God hears the cries of the people. And so we faithfully lifted up Jeff in prayer. And I followed his story from a distance ever since. And so when I was looking for a guest speaker who could speak to what I think is such a profound human condition, the ability, even in the midst of suffering, to find that God uses that in powerful ways, I knew Jeff was the right person to ask. Recently, he did write a book, and it is going to be available after the service. If you want to talk to Jeff or go buy his book out in the lobby, you're welcome to do so. And it shares more of his story, but it's such a powerful testimony to what God does, even in the midst of our pain and suffering. So I'm going to invite Jeff to come on up, and let's give him a warm welcome here at 6:10.
Over here. So I think that he said he wasn't sure which was. I'm pretty sure that you guys got married before us. So you were the first wedding. And my wife and 2 kids wanted to come as well, but they were, we live down in Tennessee now, and my daughter had a basketball tournament this weekend, so they weren't able to make it. So, but I really appreciate you guys having me, and I'm excited to share my story with y'all. So I actually always thought that having a near-death experience where you suffer an injury that forever changed your life will be something that's permanently ingrained in your mind. I thought you'd be able to easily remember what happened to you and vividly tell the story of the event whenever and to whomever you wanted. Well, in my case, I was wrong. Because every time I get up in front of a group of people like this to tell my story, or to tell mine, I just have to read it off my iPad. But I think you'll soon understand why that is. So I was on a much-needed vacation. I was relaxing in a fancy hotel room. I was laying on a nice, big, comfortable bed, looking out a crystal clear window and admiring the beautiful ocean views. At least that's where I thought I was and what I thought I was doing. I was actually a patient on the 10th floor of a rehab hospital, the Rehab Institute, located right downtown Chicago on the always busy Lakeshore Drive. And I was stuck in a sterile white hospital room, trying to get some much-needed rest on a not-so-comfy bed, and gazing through a hazy window that overlooked the chilly waters of Lake Michigan. Just 2.5 weeks before this imaginary trip to the beach, I was living what many people would call the American dream. It was a dream I worked hard for, and it's one I thought was well-deserved. I had a loving wife, I had 2 amazing children, and I was working as a family doctor in a small town in northwest Indiana called Demont. It was a place very similar to the rural farming community where I was born and raised, a town called Rosedale, found in the west central part of the state. Jenna were both at home tending to a garage sale, which was an annual event in our charming little neighborhood. My son Jace was a kindergartner, so he already gone to school for the day. And since it was a Thursday, which was my normal day off from the office, I'd run in town to buy some hanging baskets for the front porch. It was an item my wife was looking to purchase, and my father-in-law just called to tell us they now had in stock at the local hardware store he owned. Now, I can remember going to the store that morning, but I don't remember leaving it. In fact, I can remember nothing else about the rest of the day, so the only reason I know what happened is because other people have filled me in on the day's details. I was driving home from the hardware store when I stopped my black, full-size Dodge Ram pickup truck at a four-way flashing red light. The light was at a busy intersection of two highways that I drove through nearly every day. When it was my turn and I was making my way through the intersection, a large red Chevy work truck traveling nearly 60 miles per hour failed to stop or even slow down at the light and struck my passenger side. This first impact resulted in my truck being pushed and wrapped around a concrete utility pole, with my head powerfully striking the pole on the second impact. A young woman whose family members were all patients of mine was at a nearby service station getting her oil changed and heard the loud noise made from the crash. So she immediately came over to my truck to make sure I was still alive, to see if I was still breathing, and she has some medical background of some sort, so she was really checking to see if she would need to start administering CPR. After discovering that I'd somehow survived the massively destructive wreckage, she promptly called 911. When I talked to her later on, she told me how at the time she made the call, she was still unaware that it was her doctor that she'd seen lying barely alive in the severely damaged vehicle. The rescue workers who came to the scene had to cut the top off my truck to get me out. I was put into an ambulance and transferred across the street to an open area where a helicopter could safely land. After being placed in the helicopter, I was flown to a trauma center just outside of Chicago. It was my first ever helicopter flight, and one I doubt I'll ever remember. Based on the looks of my truck, it's an absolute miracle that I survived. And it's also a miracle that I suffered relatively few injuries. I did have several broken ribs, one of which resulted in a punctured lung, requiring the placement of a chest tube at the scene of the accident. Now, this was a tube that I promptly removed myself on the flight up to Chicago. I guess I didn't need it anymore. I don't know. Now, though I guess it's technically only one, and one whose significance I way underestimated at first, my most life-changing and permanent injury was a severe traumatic brain injury, also known as a TBI, that occurred when my head struck the concrete pole. For the next 2.5 weeks, I wasn't in a coma per se, but I was suffering from something they call post-traumatic amnesia. That's a condition that commonly occurs after someone suffers a brain injury. It's the period immediately following a brain injury where you don't know who you are, who other people are, where you're at, or why you're there. And I guess that's what still seems strange to me today. Here was a time when my life was literally hanging in the balance, when my future was so unknown, when my loved ones were living in nightmare every single day and every single night, and I had no clue what was taking place. There are times I still feel guilty that my family and friends had to go through such a There are times I still feel guilty that my family and friends had to go through such a difficult and trying time, while I just laid there totally oblivious to the stressful and life-threatening situation at hand. I really can't imagine how tough it must have been for them to watch me struggling so much to get better, and not knowing if I was ever going to. My post-traumatic amnesia was lasting so long that my doctors were talking about transferring me to another long-term inpatient rehab facility. And this was a place they thought I might be for several more months, maybe even years. Miraculously, it was about the same time they started looking for a place to send me that I began to improve. I started to become more with it. I began to be more awake. I even improved enough that I was able to go home and continue my therapy as an outpatient after just 1 month of being in the hospital. This was much different than having to endure another prolonged stay at a different facility like my doctors had originally speculated. Now, my main goal when I returned home was to get back to my old self, my old normal. And this was despite what my medical providers had been insistently telling me from the very start of my recovery. That someone who suffers a brain injury as severe as mine would have to find what they refer to as their new normal. So getting back to my old normal meant, of course, I wanted to go back to my old job. I wanted to return to being a family doctor. I wanted to continue taking care of my patients. And that's why I asked that my rehabilitation be targeted at giving me the greatest chance of making this happen. And amazingly, after just 5 months of intensive therapy, much to everyone's surprise, I did it. When I returned to work, I'd have to start using many of the new strategies that I just learned during therapy. This meant I was practicing medicine in a way that looked totally different than it did before. Just a few things. I had to work at a much slower pace, so I was seeing a lot fewer patients. I required a much quieter environment and more privacy. I had to focus on one thing at a time rather than depending on my previous ability to multitask. Well, that's probably questionable, according to my wife. With our opinion. I now dealt with OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, so I would relook over and over again at all the details of my patient's charts. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. So this meant charting and just working in general took me a lot longer than it had before. To overcome my newly acquired memory problems, I had to take down many notes and jot down lots of reminders when I was seeing patients. And this was much unlike before when my memory was such a strength of mine, and I depended on it for so much of my job. I had to start relying on a lot more help while at work from my nurses and other office staff in order to be successful at my job, something they were more than willing to offer me. Other than while at work, I also started to need a lot more help at home with many of my other regular everyday activities. Many of these were things that I was once able to easily do by myself with no help at all. I can remember being very discouraged when I thought of how different things were now. When before it seemed like with enough hard work and determination, I was able to accomplish most things on my own. But now I had to depend on the help of others to do these very same things. Now I was and I still am extremely grateful for all the wonderful people in my life who generously and selflessly gave of their time and energy to help me. Family, friends, co-workers, church members. There are really so many people I need to thank. The patience and acceptance they've shown me in my new normal is something I will never forget and will hopefully never take for granted. I'm really not sure where I'd be today without the prayers and unending love and support of so many people. But it was also during this time I've learned to accept my new normal and how to accept help from others that I started to understand something that changed my perspective on literally everything in my life. I finally understood how I'd never been doing things on my own. How all my life, even long before my brain injury, I'd been getting a lot of help from someone else. It was someone I already knew about, but didn't know nearly as well as I thought. That someone's name was Jesus. that someone's name was Jesus, and I can remember exactly when I finally started to understand who he truly was, how much he loved me, and how much he'd always been helping me. So it was late in the year of 2013, so it's probably about a year and a half after my accident, and my wife had went to a conference at a church in Dallas, Texas. And my wife was actually the one who wanted to go to this conference. She thought it would be helpful for the job she had at our local church. I was really just tagging along, looking to get away for a few days. I felt like I needed some time to clear my mind. I was starting to get more down about my condition and that my recovery had slowed down so much. I had just taken my family medicine boards exam, which I did pass, but it was so much harder for me than before. It was obvious to me that my brain didn't work as well as it used to. But back to as far as the conference goes, honestly, after other than going to this conference to get a little R&R, I had very low expectations when I left for the conference. I think that's because I've been a Christian and around church for most of my life. I had slowly developed the attitude and mindset that I already had most everything figured out in regards to my faith. So I really couldn't imagine hearing anything new or learning any life-changing lessons while I was at the conference. I couldn't have been more wrong. There was a speaker at the conference, honestly, I don't remember who it was, but I'll never forget the words they said. The speaker was talking about a verse from the book of Revelation. And the verse was Revelation 3:16, where Jesus is addressing the church in the city of Laodicea. And he says to them, "So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth." Now, although Revelation was a book of the Bible I didn't know much about, because I always found it so confusing and difficult to understand, this particular verse was one I was familiar with. But in the past, when I heard this verse, I just think, man, I'm sure thankful I'm not one of those lukewarm guys who get spit out by God. I didn't think these were bad people. They were people who thought they were doing just fine, and they had no idea God felt that way about them and how he viewed their lukewarm behavior. They sincerely thought they were doing enough. But that day when I heard the verse, instead of feeling thankful that I wasn't one of the lukewarms, it was like God was speaking directly to me, making me aware and convicting me of my own lukewarmness. I don't know if that's a word or not, lukewarmness. I use it. You know, you put that word in the computer, like underlines it, like what's that word? But so I'm still going to use it. This realization would change my heart, and I would begin to rethink and question everything I thought I already knew about what it truly meant to be a Christian. I started to learn what a follower of Jesus was truly supposed to look like, and discovered how I really didn't look like much of one. I realized I've been following what I've heard called an inverted gospel, which means I claim to be following Jesus, but really I just invited him to follow me. I realized how my Christian faith had always been based on following rules in order to please God, by checking off the right boxes so God would love and accept me. It had never been about having a true relationship with Jesus and learning to completely trust him and letting him change me. I'd always focused on not doing certain things so God wouldn't punish me, and conveniently ignored what he was actually telling me to do. I'd certainly always wanted to go to heaven when I died, but I was not fully aware of how followers of Jesus were called and empowered to bring heaven down right now. I had heard of the Holy Spirit before, but really had no clue who he was, that he was not just some vague idea, and I certainly wasn't aware of the miraculous power he can bring to your life. So at this point in my recovery, I remember being simply amazed at all the work God had done, and was still doing in my life. I had this miraculous story of survival, and was still able to live a fulfilling life with my amazing wife and children. I had a miraculous recovery from a severe brain injury, and was back doing a job I loved, in a job I felt like I was made for. And God had just miraculously changed my heart, had awakened me from my lukewarmness, and I felt like I was running closer and closer to Him and learning more and more about Him each and every day. But just about the time I started to get comfortable, when I felt like God had to be finished with all my drastic changes, something else happened that suddenly altered the trajectory of my life once again. I'd been back to work for 3 years when my neurologist had me come in to see him in the office. It's an appointment I'll never forget. That appointment is when my doctor told me it was time for me to retire. This was not in a few months, it was not in a few weeks, not even in a few days, but immediately. An MRI that I just had done showed evidence that my brain was shrinking, something my doctor thought was due to my injury and was likely being accelerated by the type of work I was doing. He was very concerned this would continue to worsen and it would soon start causing problems with my ability to effectively do my job. So I remember at this time, I really didn't know what to make of this news. Because at the time, I planned on working as a doctor for many more years. I really had no plan B. I didn't have any backup plan. I started questioning myself and wondering whether I hadn't worked hard enough or if I didn't do something I should have done. Was there something that could have prevented my early retirement? I remember feeling all kinds of emotions at the time that I wasn't used to feeling. So there's a long list here, so bear with me. So I was scared, confused, angry, bitter, incompetent, lost, sad, worried, anxious, depressed, purposeless, dumb, stupid, and embarrassed. But somehow, in the midst of all this chaos, this mess of emotions, I began to find hope. I started believing that there had to be something else out there for me to do. I just knew that God hadn't brought me back this far for nothing. I eventually felt like that my new purpose was to tell people my story and about the lessons God was teaching me through my brain injury. To point them to the real author of my story, to show them Jesus, and to share with them where I found my hope. However, I became quickly disappointed. I quickly became disappointed with what I thought was my new calling. Because every time I attempted to share my story, I'd have a difficult time finding the right words to explain myself, an issue that I now struggle with because of my brain injury. I became extremely frustrated, and because of this frustration, I started choosing not to say anything at all. But after a while, something didn't feel right with this decision. I really felt like I was holding back on what God was calling me to do. So at the suggestion of one of my friends, I decided to try, guess what you call it, journaling. I go to the local library and journal nearly every day, writing down, or I guess in my case, typing parts of my story and trying to explain what God had been and still was teaching me. I know you don't know me before, but you have to understand that journaling was something that I wouldn't even consider before my brain injury. But it seemed to be a really good way for me to explain and describe what I was going through, so I continued to do so. And eventually, again from the encouragement of one of my friends, I decided it was time to share my story and some of what I've been writing down with other people. And this is when I decided to turn my journal into a blog, which at the time, when he said my friend said, you should do a blog, I didn't know what a blog was, so I had to get some help with that. And eventually, and amazingly, I became a published author when my blog turned into a book that came out in stores in November of this past year. Now, because of the way God has beautifully redeemed and is wonderfully rewriting my story, I often get asked the question, would you actually say now that you're thankful you suffered a brain injury? And for the longest time, my answer to these people was always an adamant and definitive no way. I wish my brain injury had never happened. I wouldn't wish a brain injury on even my worst enemy. But God has, again, miraculously, being able to give me a new perspective on what has taken place in my life. Because of this new perspective, my answer to this question, I believe, has changed as well. It's an answer that I think we found at the end of what was a goodbye letter that I one day decided to sit down and write to my brain injury. So this goodbye letter reads, this is the end of it. It says, "Dear brain injury, I know it's going to sound crazy for me to say this to you, but I'm starting to think you might have changed my life for the better. You see, before I met you, I really thought I was something. That I had a good handle on my life and could deal with most things thrown my way. But after you showed up, it was a much different story. I couldn't do it all anymore, and I had to start getting help from so many other people. Most importantly, it wasn't until after we met that I finally understood how much I needed Jesus. I started to see him for who he truly is, came to realize who I was not. See, I'd spent most of my life so busy trying to please God and earn my salvation with my good behavior. But I finally began to understand that I can never do enough and that Jesus has already done it all for me, and he is really all I need. So brain injury, there's no doubt you forever changed me in more ways than I can count. But I think now I'm actually glad we had the chance to meet, because I believe you are a way for me to find the real Jesus. And he has changed me in more ways than you ever could have. All right, now before I finish up this morning, I'd like to tell you one more real quick story about something that I said just a few days prior to my accident. Something I can't remember saying, but the words would end up being quite foreshadowing. So this one night, our small group from church was hanging out at our house, and we decided to go around the room and have everyone share their testimony. Each one of us would tell our own unique and personal story about how and why we became a Christian. When it came around to me, it was my turn to share. I apologized to the rest of the group that I had nothing to add to the conversation. I'd grown up in the church and been a Christian for as long as I could remember. And I felt like I'd always done a pretty good job of staying on, I guess, what they call the straight and narrow path, a path that I heard about from a very young age. So because of this, I thought my story was very boring. Couldn't imagine why anyone would want me or need me to tell it to them. I guess that I even went on to say how I was jealous of people who had a meaningful or compelling story. The kind where something big takes place in their life and it changes them forever. Well, just 1 week later, it was May 3rd, 2012, the day of my accident. You know, since the night I uttered those words to my small group, I have learned a very important truth. And it's a truth I wish wouldn't have required a near-death experience and life-altering brain injury for me to learn. The truth is that I really didn't need some kind of dramatic story to have an effect on other people. Long before that day, I already had a story to tell. I just didn't realize it yet. The truth is that all of us have a story to tell. Despite what the world seems to be constantly telling us, our stories don't need some sort of emotionally driven plot line to help other people. Because the simple story of a life surrendered to and lived for Jesus, a story that points people to him, is always worth telling. Thank you so much for letting me come here today and share my story with y'all.